What's up, fellow creator? If you're like me, you probably wonder what settings should I be using with my camera for, uploading to YouTube. Let me tell you that the absolute best settings for you are going to be very dependent on what equipment you're using and what scene you're trying to shoot. So these are my recommendations on what camera settings you should be using to film your YouTube videos. The first setting you're going to want to look at in your camera is, what is your resolution set to? You're probably going to want to set this to the highest value possible in your camera. So if your camera is only capable of 1080p, then that's going to be the setting you want to use. But if your camera is capable of 4K, you probably want to shoot in that resolution. There are some things to consider when choosing the resolution you're shooting in, like what your final project export will be. If your final project's only going to be 1080p, then you may not want to use 4K. You've also got to consider whether or not the computer you're going to edit on is capable of editing that 4K footage easily, or is that going to be kind of a nightmare for you. The next setting you should consider for your YouTube videos is the frame rate. It depends on what your camera supports, and I've seen a lot of creators saying they prefer 24 frames per second, but 30 frames per second to me seems to be a very common frame rate among many different types of cameras, and also kind of the standard for web video. There's some debate that 24 frames per second will make it look more cinematic and filmic. I personally haven't really seen much of that, so I tend to shoot everything in 30 frames per second. The exception to that would be if you're wanting to shoot something in slow motion, you actually want to choose a higher frame rate, like double what your final project is going to be. So if you're shooting everything in 30 frames per second and you need some really sweet slow motion video, you're probably going to want to shoot it at 60 frames per second so that when you slow it down, it's very natural looking at 30 frames per second. If you shoot 30 frames per second and then try to slow it down, if you slow it by 50%, you actually end up with 15 frames per second, and it's going to look very jittery and unnatural. Another camera setting you're going to want to adjust for your YouTube videos is your ISO. This one's a tricky one because it's going to depend on a few things. First of all, if you're shooting in a log format, there's usually a base ISO that you want to hang on to. For instance, this video is shot in Canon C-Log 3, which has a base ISO of 800, so I have to try to work around that 800. So if I need more light, I have to just bring in more light. I really don't want to mess with that ISO setting. If you're not shooting in a log format, you really want to keep that ISO setting as low as possible. ISO is like gain or artificial light that's getting put into your video. So the higher the number, the more grainy the final video is going to look. If you shoot something with an ISO of 10,000 versus an ISO 100, there's going to be a huge difference in noise in the high ISO footage versus the low ISO footage. You can actually use the automatic ISO setting on your camera. That's why it's there. But let me give you this piece of advice. If you're going to use the automatic ISO function, turn it on and expose your shot so that you can see what ISO number the camera has chosen to use automatically, and then go into the settings and actually lock it on that ISO. As long as the lighting in the video is fairly consistent, this is going to really improve the quality of your videos because the camera's not going to auto dim and auto lighten, which doesn't look as professional. Another setting you want to pay attention to for your YouTube videos is going to be your shutter speed. There is a rule that I go by that you want to shoot in a shutter speed that is double what your frame rate is. So I'm shooting at 30 frames per second, so my shutter speed is 1/60th of a second. If I was shooting in 24 frames per second, then I would want to use a shutter speed of 1/50th. And if I was shooting at 60 frames per second, I'd want my shutter speed to be 1/120th of a second. This is not set in stone. This is a general guideline that's going to give you the most natural looking movements and stuff, just the correct amount of motion blur. In certain situations, you may have to jack that shutter speed up. The more you increase the shutter speed, the less motion blur you're going to have, so that can really convey a very intense look. If you're having a battle scene in your video or something that's just very dramatic, that lack of motion blur can really help out. And you may occasionally have to run it down a little bit. I've shot down as low as 1/30th of a second, but if you get anything below that, it's really not a good look. You also want to pay attention to aperture. Now, the aperture, also referred to as the f-stop, is going to be how wide open that iris is on your lens. I'm shooting at f2.8, which is the lowest that this lens will go, which gives me me in focus, but the background's slightly out of focus. I think it's a good look. It really makes me stand out more from my background. Something you'd want to pay attention to if you have a more expensive camera would be the log functions. Shooting log footage actually preserves detail in the shadows and in the highlights, but at the expense of not being very sharp or colorful straight out of the camera. Log footage does not look good straight out of the camera. You're gonna have to apply LUTs and or do some color correcting and color grading to make it look good, but I think it's definitely a good look, and if you have the capability, you should explore it. Another camera setting you should set is your picture style. If you have the ability to change between standard and neutral and faithful and monochrome and different picture styles, you probably want to leave it on something like standard. If you're not really wanting to do any tweaking in post-production, you may want to go ahead and boost your saturation just a little bit. But in most cameras, that standard picture profile looks really good. These next few are actually not camera settings, but they're things that I still think are worth mentioning to increase the quality of video that you're getting. One of them is you want to either put the camera on a tripod like I've got here, or you want to have some sort of stabilization going on. Shaky footage is not easy to watch. You also want to light your scene very well. I think lighting is very underrated, and to achieve the look that a lot of people are trying to get, the style videos that a lot of people are trying to get, is more of a lighting trick than it is a camera setting trick. It's something I think you're going to have to do some experimentation with. This video is being lit from this angle with a diffused light box thing that I got off Amazon. I have an undiffused light way over there that's providing some light on this side of my face, and then of course we've got lights in the background that are just there for interest. Let's change the lighting and see how different this would look. Now everything is exactly the same room, same camera, same settings. Only difference is all of my other lights have been turned off, and I've turned on an overhead light. So hopefully that demonstrates what a big difference lighting can make in a video. Along with the stable footage and the good lighting, you're also going to want some good sound. A lot of cameras record some pretty good sound on their own, but in my opinion, an external microphone produces a better sound, and you can pump that quality a little bit more by adding some EQ in post. I like to go into the audio settings of the camera and disable the auto so that I can manually set my level and actually use the built-in sound meter to make sure that I'm getting a good level audio. If you're using an external microphone and it has a gain or level adjustment, you usually want to max that thing out. It's usually better to have that higher level sound coming from the microphone rather than having too much gain added in the camera body. Okay, so let's reiterate some of the things that I talked about. Good camera settings for use on YouTube would be setting the resolution to the highest possible. I'm using 4K. Use a low ISO setting if you're using a regular picture style, or use the base ISO if you're shooting in log. 30 frames per second is a good frame rate on YouTube, and using a 1/60th of a second shutter to go with that. You want to use the widest aperture you can get to establish a shallow depth of field. I'm using an f2.8. You want steady footage, you want well lit footage, you want good sound with your footage, and you'll make a great video. Well, at least it'll look good. The content's actually up to you, and that's always the hardest part, right? I hope you found this helpful. If you liked the video, make sure you click like and subscribe to this new channel where I'm going to be making all kinds of like how-to and informational videos about the process of making YouTube videos. I'm Joe Somebody, and I'll see you next time.